We'll now have the ethics presentation with Tara Ho. Tara is the General Counselor as the American Society of Civil Engineers and a member of the Virginia Bar. She's a 2005 graduate of Georgetown Law and serves as Assistant General Counselor for 9 years prior to her promotion in January 2015. In addition to serving ASCE's legal counsel in areas of employment tax, contract, and intellectual property law, Tara oversees ASCE's Professional Conduct Committee and writes a monthly column, A Question of Ethics, which is published in the Civil Engineering magazine. Tara also serves as Secretary for the Committee on Publication Ethics, a UK-based charity that provides ethics guidance for scholarly publishers. Please help me welcome Tara today.
All right, thank you. And I really appreciate being invited to speak to you today about a topic that I think is very interesting and also very important. And hopefully we'll have some very interesting information for you about what ASCE is up to in terms of ethics activity. So I'm going to actually jump right in by starting out with a case. And this was a case that actually came to ASCE. And it was about there was a very large excavation for a dam actually in California. And the site for the dam was approved by the district engineer for the water area. And the contractor that was hired to perform the excavation, the contract that the person had, or the entity had a very unusual feature. Specifically, the city agreed to pay what was considered to be above market rates for the first, X number of, the X amount of depth, and then the below market rate for the work that was going to be undertaken later on in the project, the lower level of excavation work. Well, as it happened, months into the project, there was a massive landslide at the site. A team of independent investigators was called in to take a look at what happened. And their report indicated that the site was never going to be suitable for the dam, that it just, because of the condition of the soil, the rock conditions, and it just wasn't the right location to have for this dam. One of the investigators actually goes to the press with an allegation that the contractor, in this case, knew all along that the site was unsuitable and that the contract was deliberately front-loaded so that they would, because they knew that they could get paid for this, this early work and never be called upon to do the below market rates for the later work. The investigator also claimed that the district in this case was overbilled by some $700,000 for excavation work that hadn't actually been occurred. There was an investigation, and it was later found that the contractor had actually paid, not the district engineer, but another official, one of the decision-making officials, had received $80,000 in bribes from the contractor in order to get the work and the work that was front-loaded this way. So if you look at a case like this, you think, okay, who do we think are the bad actors in this case? Who are the ones that, if you were going to look at them from an ethics standpoint, who are the ones that are questionable? Obviously, the first one would be the contractor. Again, assuming the truth of of all these allegations, the contractor paid a bribe, first of all, to get the work, and arguably decided to recover their profits by using this sham technique, this front-loaded contract, knowing that they were ultimately never going to have to actually deliver on the less profitable aspect of the contract. You might also obviously note the district official, the decision maker, who took a bribe, presumably knowing that the work was going to be done fraudulently in a way in order to recoup the amount of the bribe and to make a personal benefit from it. You might also look at the district engineer. I will say that in the investigation, it was determined that the district engineer, they couldn't find any evidence that the district engineer had known that there was fraud on the project or known that a bribe had been paid. But certainly there's questions raised about the district engineer's, either his competence or his diligence. There was a lot going on under the district engineer's nose, and the fact that this project was such a, the site that was selected was unsuitable in the first place, and there was arguably fraudulent billing. So certainly the district engineer doesn't come off well in this discussion either. So you might look at whether there's an ethical question about whether he was either diligent or competent to supervise this project. Would you look at the investigator? Maybe that's, maybe with today's eyes you might think, some whistleblowers have something of an uncertain reputation. Sometimes sometimes they're seen as being media chasers. So maybe the fact that he went to the press with maybe an unproven allegation, maybe that's a little questionable, although certainly the subsequent trial, well, there was a trial, the subsequent investigation and the trial, ultimately the contractor was held responsible for paying back roughly the same amount that was alleged to have been overbilled. So certainly the investigation appears to have subsequently borne out what the investigator said in the first place. So I think by and large, many of us would look at this case today and say the investigator did the right thing, or at least he did a right thing. Whether that was exactly the best course of ethics action, certainly we wouldn't maybe question his ethics. However, this case actually came about in the 1920s, and the ASCE Code of Ethics in the 20s was considerably different than it is today. In fact, there was no language in the code at the time preventing fraud. There was no real language about bribery. There was no language about truthfulness, really. However, there was a provision that said it will be considered unprofessional and inconsistent for an engineer to attempt to injure maliciously or falsely the professional reputation of another engineer. Now, we might look at that and say, well, how does that relate to this case? Well, in the 1920s, ASCE's Board of Direction at the time was responsible for administering codes, and they thought that the investigator, by bringing this case to the public media, by shining a media spotlight on this case, that he had brought, and this is a direct quote from the letter that was issued, bringing to a brother engineer injury to his reputation. So they didn't take any action against the district engineer. They really couldn't take any action against any of the other parties involved because they weren't members. However, they expelled the whistleblower from the society for his actions in bringing to light what was clearly a very clear case of some level of ethical breach, some level of legal breach. His actions in exposing this district engineer to shame because of that was deemed to be something that rendered him unworthy of being a member of society. Why do I discuss that case? You'll find out in a little bit, but it certainly does show you as a good example of how ethics can be in the eye of the beholder, and we will see more about that as I go on. So taking a step back, I always like to make sure we're talking from the same understanding when we're talking about ethics. So this list here is just a list of some of the things that, some of the common definitions or explanations I see for what is or what are ethics. And the first word that I've highlighted is moral principles. I often hear people talk about ethics in terms of, in comparison to the law, and I sometimes see people say, okay, maybe ethics is higher than the law, or law is part of ethics. I don't think it's quite the same as that. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think ethics and the law serve two different purposes. And so sometimes they get the same answer and sometimes they don't. And even when they do get the same answer, a lot of times it's not for the same reason. And so as an example, I'll give you an example of sealing documents. Why do engineers seal documents? Well, from an ethical standpoint, they seal documents because it certifies that they reviewed them. From an ethical standpoint, from a moral standpoint, they've applied your engineering knowledge and your experience and your diligence to make sure that these plans are safe. So it's about making sure the public is safe, making sure that people can trust it. So from an ethics standpoint, you might say, if I'm a competent engineer and I've reviewed something thoroughly, and I am competent to make an assessment of the validity of a document, I would be okay to sign a document or seal a document anywhere in the United States. We know from a legal standpoint that's not true. From a legal standpoint, you have to be licensed. So the law is not about a moral decision. The law is about establishing order. It creates a system so that people have an expectation. And maybe the system that they create is intended. At the end of the day, the law is trying to get at the same thing. They're trying to ensure that designs are safe. They're trying to ensure that somebody responsible has looked over something. But they don't look at it from a moral standpoint. They look at it from a regulatory standpoint, from what kind of checklists can we put in place? What kind of systems can we put in place? So the law is about establishing order, not necessarily about the morality of a decision. Maybe a little more commonplace example would be a difference between If you're driving in a car, how fast can you go? From an ethics standpoint, from a morality standpoint, how fast are you safe to drive? Some people may be safe to drive at very fast speeds, and other people may not be particularly safe driving at any speed. So from a moral standpoint, a moral decision would be very based on what you personally are safe to do. From a legal standpoint, of course, we understand that you drive 55 here, you drive 65 here, you drive 25 there. Again, it's about setting order and establishing expectations, not about morality. So again, ethics is about morality. It's about what's right and wrong. Since we're talking about professional ethics, obviously hopefully everybody has personal ethics as well, but for the purpose of this session and for your career as engineers, we're largely talking about professional codes. The code that the profession has collectively agreed is your standard for governing behavior. Certainly the point of the code is for making good decisions, for setting out the responsibilities that you have and the duties that you owe to others, and then creating that as a model that engineers can follow. So why are ethics so important? And again, we're talking here about professional ethics. Hopefully many of you have personal ethics that are, if anything, higher even than your professional standards. But when we talk about the collective wisdom of the profession, well, what does that accomplish? Again, the first is about safeguarding society, using the example of the drawings that I just gave. It is a template for professionals to serve the public good. It makes sure that when engineers act ethically, that the things that they do ultimately protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And then the reverse side of that is credibility. Having a code of ethics makes people hopefully, are more inclined to trust people or trust professions when they know that they are acting upon on the basis of an ethical code, not just purely from self-interest. And there's always going to be some self-interest in having your career and being successful. But ethics is meant to be that higher calling. It's the thing that if you look at it, at least the classic professions, people place enormously, immensely important things in your care, in all of the professionals' care. Whether you're a doctor, that people place their lives literally in your hands, and with engineers, people place their lives on the work of an engineer. With a lawyer, people may be placing their personal freedom. Again, all very important things, and so the trust that is needed for a member of the public, for a customer to come to you or a client. And give that level of trust to you. Having a code of ethics gives you that credibility as somebody who's going to do the right thing. Education. Ethics are extremely important. Codes of ethics are extremely important as far as educating professionals on what expectations are of them as they continue on through their career. You've heard the expression before that a smart person learns from their own mistakes and a wise person learns from mistakes of others. The code of ethics is meant to embody those mistakes that other people have made and to help people from not making those mistakes in future. Long-term gains. Many, and I'll talk about this in a little bit some more, but many of the mistakes that people make, many of the ethical problems or the ethical lapses that people fall into are because they sacrifice or fail to account for long-term gains as opposed to their short-term interests. There's an immediate need to take care of, and so they make a bad decision on, to alleviate some problem without recognizing that ultimately that short-term decision may hurt them, may hurt their firm, may hurt their careers down the road. So ethics serves as the reminder that good ethics is good business, and that sacrificing ethics today may help you in the immediate future, but down the road. You may pay a greater cost than if you made the painful decision in the first place. And then lastly, of course, I think ethics is important from a standpoint of self-value. Feeling good about yourself and the work that you do. Saying that you abide by a code of ethics is kind of a powerful thing, and it's an important thing to be able to say about the work that you do, and again, that you are guided by this higher calling as a member of your professional. So again, all very important things and all very important roles that professional codes of ethics play. And you'll be happy to know that by and large, since I talked about public trust and credibility, by and large, engineers are doing a great job in terms of public perception. Hopefully you've all heard of Gallup polls. One of the they do polls. They're probably the name in national polls. And every year they do a poll where they ask members of the public, how would you rate the honesty and ethical standards of people in these various professions? And they give them a scale from very high to very low. And I've been doing this for, I've been doing this for almost 13 years, giving these kind of, and Gallup has actually been doing this poll since the 1970s, the same poll. And they don't always use the same professionals. It seems like engineers are about, every 3 or 4 years, they add engineers to the list of professions that they evaluate. And over the course of those 13 years, engineers have always ranked a consistent third, usually somewhere statistically tied with doctors, somewhere slightly below pharmacists and nurses. But just this year, you will be happy to know that this is the highest that engineers have actually ever placed on the Gallup poll. Of the professions that were evaluated, only nurses ranked higher within the public in terms of the ranking of how high you rate their ethical standards. So I think this is something to be proud of. This is fantastic. Even third, I've always said third was a tremendously great result. Something like 67%. My math here, 66% rank engineers either high or very high in terms of their ethical standards. And I think this is great. It shouldn't be surprising, speaking here as a lawyer, lawyers don't rank quite so high. I think we come in somewhere around 21%, which is actually better than I thought we would come in, so I'll take that as a good thing. But clearly do not rank as high in terms of public credibility and public perception as engineers. So that really is a credit to engineers and something that you should be proud of, that by and large, again, when people think of engineers, they think of trustworthiness and ethics. So kudos. That said, it's not actually that difficult to find examples of engineers behaving badly. In fact, to put together this slide, I literally just went to Google and typed engineer convicted. And not surprisingly, you find a lot of hits. Here's a Volkswagen engineer. We all know what that case was about. Most of them end up involving some level of procurement fraud or unfair competition. Well, in the tech industry, this is not necessarily a civil engineer, but in the tech industry, I mean, there's a very recent and so notorious example with a former Google engineer who downloaded 14 gigabytes worth of data about the Google self-driving car and took it with him to his new employer to design their self-driving car. It's not all that difficult to find examples, unfortunately, of engineers doing things that challenge that public perception of how ethical and how, again, not selfish, but selfless the engineering profession is. So I look at those cases and I think, somebody might look at this case and say, gosh, some of these cases, these are just bad actors, the sort of bad apples that don't really reflect the profession as a whole. But I think it's important to look at these folks and say, maybe there are some bad apples, and maybe there are people out there that have been self-driving and maybe don't really reflect the professional ethics as a whole. But I strongly suspect that many of these people got into the profession for the same reasons that everyone else did, that you did. Wanting to do the right thing, wanting to have a good career while doing something worthwhile and meaningful. And, certainly, again, here's Mr. Volkswagen engineer here. I don't think he probably envisioned himself, his picture being on the New York Times as, the face of the Volkswagen diesel scandal. He probably thought, again, he was just going to be doing, he probably embarked on his career intending to follow the law and to do the right thing at all times. And so I look at these things and I think, why do people who are ethical in general, or why do people have those lofty goals, why do they sometimes make unethical decisions? I think it's not necessarily something that, I think it's sometimes things that people do fall into, even if they really have good intentions, or even if they never thought they would be the person to do the wrong thing. And the spectrum here that I've drawn, or the 3 bullets here I've drawn, it's based on in an accounting principle called the fraud triangle. And I think it applies to more than just fraud, and obviously I didn't draw it as a triangle, but I think it is really meaningful in terms of what kinds of things make people make bad decisions. And obviously the first one, my first bullet here is incentive. Obviously, if you don't have the incentive to do the wrong thing, you're not going to do the wrong thing. But incentives are everywhere. Probably the biggest incentive is pressure. Pressure to deliver results, pressure to bring home a client, pressure to keep a client, pressure to win a contract, fear of losing your job, fear of being ostracized, fear of not getting that promotion, fear of not making your personal ends meet. Obviously, desire for personal gain. You can't ignore that. We all, many of us wish we could make more money than we do, and so again, that may be an incentive to do something to cut a corner. The second level is the second step in the fraud triangle, or this spectrum, is opportunity. It doesn't matter if we have all the poor incentives in the world. If we don't have the opportunity to do something wrong, we're okay. We're not gonna take that wrong step. But in many cases, there is an opportunity. You may have a company that doesn't really have a lot of oversight, internal or external. Your client may not scrutinize things quite as closely, or your employer. So timesheets are not something that are looked at very closely. You may even have a poor corporate culture, or even an absent corporate culture, where again, people do things and nobody says anything, nobody blinks. You're not really rewarded for doing the right thing. In fact, you may even be rewarded for, or you may see others or perceive that others are being rewarded for doing the wrong thing. So opportunity is the second thing. But the third thing, and the thing that I think is probably the most important thing to think about, is the rationalization. Even if you have incentive and opportunity, some people may not take that opportunity without that rationalization, without that, here's why I'm going to go ahead and do it. And I've listed a few of the ones that I most commonly hear. Again, with ASCE, one of my roles is to participate in the complaints against members, complaints for violating the ASCE Code of Ethics. And these are some of the things that I hear. Everyone else is doing it. You always hear about pay to play. You hear about, if I didn't pay that bribe, or if I didn't do that, another company was just going to do it. So, it's the only way I could survive in this business market, is to be somebody who pays that kickback, or who offers that shady deal or shady loan to somebody in a position of power. And sometimes I'll hear victimless crime. No one was being harmed. If I plagiarized something, or I did something, something trivial that may violate the Code of Ethics, but who really is hurting by that? I'm just doing what I need to do. With the phrase victimless crime, right? No other choice. Again, that's the pressure thing. My company desperately needed this work. We desperately needed to do this. My boss told me to do this. I can't afford to be looking for a job in this terrible market. I didn't have any choice but to go ahead and make that unethical decision. And often I hear people say something along the lines of, I can make up for that later. I figured if I did this thing. Actually, Volkswagen is a great example of that. As I understand it, there was tremendous pressure on the engineers responsible for designing the compliance with the emission standards. Tremendous pressure to get the product to the market, and they just simply technologically couldn't figure out how to meet those emission standards. And so they did the cheat. They created the cheat code. They created the cheat, and their rationalization in some ways was, we're just going to put this out there, and we're going to figure it out. That's going to give us more time to figure out the problem. And then once we figure out the problem, we'll fix the vehicles and we'll make sure they operate. Well, obviously that isn't what happened. But again, the I can make up for this, no one will know, no one will be harmed, is a lot of times that rationalization that lets you make the wrong ethical choice. So recognizing that we may not be able to do something about incentive, and maybe we can do things about opportunity, but maybe not always. How do you prevent yourself from making that rationalization? How do you solve a challenge when you're in an ethical dilemma? Obviously, the first step is to understand the Code of Ethics. Make sure if you don't recognize that you're doing something unethical, you're obviously not going to correct the problem. How are you aware when you have a conflict of interest? How are you aware when something is, you're not acting in the best interest of your clients? Study the Code of Ethics to understand what your responsibilities are. Ask the right questions. Again, understanding what your obligations are makes you ask the question, should I be doing this? Again, what is the right course of action? If you're having trouble answering those questions, look for additional resources, ASCE certainly being one of them, but there are lots of resources out there. Your company may have resources. You may have an ethics counsel or an advisor of some sort or a trusted advisor. When in doubt, seek help. That actually is probably the best thing that you can do. Try to find somebody, even if it's within your company, if you feel comfortable with that, or somebody whose judgment you trust. Whether that's another engineer or even somebody who's outside of the engineering, outside of your professional community. Contact ASCE. We have, myself, my phone number is made available. I'm going to make it available here at the end of this presentation. I'm always happy to talk to somebody about an ethics dilemma. And if I can't give my own recommendation, not being an engineer myself, I'm happy to put somebody in touch with one of our committee members who is also happy to offer recommendations. But definitely don't feel that you have to make a decision in a vacuum. If you're in a true quandary, do indeed seek help. So here's a second case, another example of a case that actually came to ASCE. In this particular case, we had there was a public contract in, I'll say Shanghai. It was an international, very large international city, huge project. And the city voluntarily decided to undergo the QBS process. Qualifications based. So they had people submit their credentials, they selected a bidder, and then they began the process of negotiating a contract. Well, 6 months into the contract negotiation, one of the bidders who had been rejected, was not the one that was being negotiated with, submitted an unsolicited proposal with pricing information, and also had done so somewhat in partnership with a local consultant. So there was a joint proposal, basically, as opposed to sort of like the international bidders. And the public owner abruptly terminated the negotiation with the original candidate and said, you know what, we're going to go ahead and just award the contract, kind of forget about the QBS process. We're just going to award this contract to this new partnership. Is that ethical? Is that something we would feel good about? I think many people today might look at this and feel like this was at least a little shady. It's definitely, it's definitely not something that we would think is, a high mark, something that we should all aspire to do, to try to sneak in those bids. But is it unethical? Well, again, this was an earlier case. This was a case that came in the 1960s, and at the time of this case, the ASCE code again looked quite a bit different than it does today. And it said, inconsistent with honorable and dignified bearing for a member to attempt to supplant another engineer in a particular engagement. There was an ethics complaint filed against the two ASCE members who were part of the competing firm, and they were suspended. The president for 3 years and the vice president for 2 years for their efforts in supplanting for subverting this QBS process. Well, fast forward maybe 6 or so months, and knock on the door, the proverbial door, and ASCE gets a visit from the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, telling us that they have deemed our code of ethics to be in violation of federal antitrust law. And if you're familiar at all with antitrust law, it's basically a law that prevents collusion to suppress price competition. And antitrust law is notoriously unfriendly to codes of ethics because they see professional codes of ethics as an agreement among market competitors. And so if there is any language in a code of ethics where we all kind of agree to do something that's maybe anti-price, the FTC takes that very seriously. And as far as they were concerned, in this particular case, as an example, the firm that we disciplined had done nothing other than submit pricing information. And so by saying that was unethical, we were violating the federal legal principle in support of the values of price-based competition. So I've done now 2 cases. I gave you a 20s case, I gave you a 60s case. And my super secret reason for giving you that is to talk about how ethics changes over generations. There's a common quote that I've seen that I typically like, this quote that I have here, where ethics is never a weather vane, it's a compass forever fixed. And that may be true within sort of a personal, as a personal guide, if you look at a North Star as being your North Star for ethics. But generationally, that is really not so much the truth. ethics does change. The things that people find important today may be tremendously different from the things that people thought were important 40, 50 years ago, and maybe even more different from what people are going to think 40 years from now. And so if you look at ASCE's code over the past 100 years, it has changed a lot as an adaptation of what we felt are, as an adaptation of what ethics has come to mean. Clearly the case of the 1920s shows that we didn't think as highly of documenting our obligations to truthfulness and objectivity and the public welfare. That is tremendously changed. In the 1960s, clearly we were very restrictive on price because we thought that we were protecting, we collectively, ASCE, thought we were protecting the public from people that might cut corners or do things that were unsafe in order to save a buck. But obviously that was conflicting with the law, and so we were forced to change our ethical code and to develop our ethical code to reflect an understanding that pricing is not something we can restrict. More recently, we've added language about sustainability. Sustainability was not in the Code of Ethics until the late 1994, I think it was. We added language on corruption in the early 2000s to make it clear that we would not tolerate bribery, fraud, and corruption even in the global marketplace. And then very recently we added inclusion, so making it an ethical obligation to be respectful of people regardless of their race, religion, or other protected characteristic. And 2020, I've got these great red question marks here because, as you may or may not know, ASCE about a year ago created a task committee to take a look at the Code of Ethics as a whole. The code that currently exists was approved, other than the few changes that I mentioned listed as the 20,000 in the 20,000s or 2000s. Our code has remained fundamentally unchanged since the 1970s, and that may be earlier than some of you were born. Certainly longer than many of you have been practicing. So it's a 45-year-old language, and love it or hate it, some people think that the language is dated. Some people think that the principles are dated. Somebody told me they thought it read like Shakespeare. It's a code that's been around for a long time, and so it was a decision made by the executive committee to take a look at the code and to see whether or not there was room for modifying the code. Here is the code as it reads today. And as I mentioned, other than the parts that were in green, everything here that's listed in blue has been in our code unchanged since the 1970s. And their supplemental guidelines are too lengthy. I mean, it's a 4-page document to go through the various guidelines, and most of those have remained fundamentally unchanged for more than 40 years too. So the task committee has recently, within the last year, has come back to the board, and they have proposed what they consider to be is a dramatic change to the Code of Ethics. And probably and I'm going to go into some detail on what this code looks like. That's basically going to be the remainder of this program. One of probably the biggest change is they're breaking, instead of having 8 canons, they've decided to break the code up into stakeholders. And the reason for that is maybe a usability. If you ask somebody what Canon 2, what Canon 4, what Canon 6 of the Code of Ethics is, most people aren't going to be able to tell you what those canons are. But if you ask somebody what your obligations are to your peers, what your obligations are to the profession, what your obligations are to the public, it resonates more with people. People are more able to identify their obligations. And so setting it out and breaking it out into what they consider stakeholders is a way of making it more user-friendly for professionals. For example, if you have a question about, say, you've been asked to review another engineer's work, and you're not sure what your ethical obligations are in terms of critiquing another's work, you may not think to look in Canon 5 of ASCE's current Code of Ethics to find what it says about competition, but it would be very obvious that you would go to the peers section in this modified Code of Ethics. So again, meant to be more user-friendly. Another thing that is a very big change, and it actually is spelled out in the preamble. One of the things that I have commonly heard people complain, in terms of complaints about the Code of Ethics, one of the things that I've often heard is that, how do I handle a problem if Canon 3 tells me one thing and Canon 2 tells me something else? There's really no real method for balancing which canon trumps when there are two different messages. We do say first, and we do say hold paramount when it comes to public health, safety, and welfare. But if it's not a public safety or health issue, you know, if your client tells you to do something that's not exactly truthful, you know, does canon 4, obligation to your client, supersede canon 3, obligation to be truthful? There's no real guidance on that in the current Code of Ethics. Well, today, and I want you to center in on the last paragraph here, the stakeholders are spelled out in order of importance. So stakeholder 1 is society. Every obligation that is society is meant to be the most important. Number 2 is environment. Number 3 is, and I'm thinking, we'll get to this. Number 3 is your obligation to the profession. And number 4, possibly controversially, is clients and employers. So if your clients or employers, if there's an obligation to a client or employer that conflicts with 3, 2, or 1, in theory, the message of this code is that you are meant to follow that higher obligation. So there's a very clear hierarchy within the stakeholders as far as what your obligations are. So let's dig down a little bit into this. And I should have said probably earlier, ASCE, this is a proposed code of ethics. It is going to the board for first reading. By the time you've seen this, it will have gone to the board for first reading on July 10th. And assuming it, which I don't expect it not to, get at least the approval to go to the second vote, assuming it reaches the board, the first vote, it will then go to the society. It'll be published by the society, and the board will have its final vote in October. So if the vote is approved, this code of ethics will take force as of October. But this is the draft that has gone to the board, and there may be room for some revisions. But by and large, this is the code that's going to be voted on in October. So here they are. Number 1, society, and this is not just the public health, safety, and welfare. This is not just Canon 1. This is the list of things that the task committee has felt to be the most important of your ethical obligations. And to some extent, it's a synthesis of some of the other canons. You will find language that resonates with our Canon 6 language on bribery, fraud, and corruption. I didn't list it here as D. Canon 8's equity and inclusion is here in guideline F. And by and large, I think I will say that many of this organizationally is clearly different and hierarchy is clearly different. But I do think some of the fundamental principles, most of the fundamental principles are very similar to what exists in our current code. But there are a few outliers, and I will give you a bit of an example here. So as a test case, engineer discovers that his firm is paying kickbacks to a local public official in exchange for engineering work. Engineer believes that the scheme has been authorized by the firm's top executive, meaning that internal reporting is not going to address the illegal practice. It's going all the way to the top, and so there's nothing you can do within the organization to stop the illegal practice or unethical practice. Does the engineer have an ethical obligation to report this fraud to the proper authorities? Now, can the engineer do so? When we talk about ethics and reporting, there's 3 levels. There's permissive, there's recommended, and then there's obligation. It's certainly permitted for an engineer to report fraud to an outside authority. I think we probably agree that it's even recommended for an engineer to report fraud. But is it an ethical obligation? Is it, in other words, is it unethical to fail to report something that you know is going on in your company? And our current code of ethics is kind of vague on that point. Our current code says engineers that have knowledge or reason to believe that another person may be in violation of Canon 1 shall report it to the property authority in writing. Well, what's Canon 1? Canon 1 is the public health, safety, and welfare. Now, maybe you can make the argument that any act of fraud is a violation of public health, safety, and welfare, but we've never really gone that far. Usually when we're talking about Canon 1, we're talking about things where people's lives are at stake. So the only really affirmative reporting obligation in today's code relates to things about public health, safety, and welfare. We do say 0 tolerance for bribery, fraud, and corruption, but that's subject to interpretation. Does 0 tolerance mean I just have to quit my job and go work somewhere else? Or does 0 tolerance mean I have to tell the authorities that my firm is doing something fraudulent? In the proposed new code, they've eliminated that uncertainty. The proposed new code says engineers shall have zero tolerance for bribery, fraud, and corruption in all forms, and report violations to the proper authorities. So as far as changes in the code, maybe this is a minor change, maybe this is a sea change, but the drafters of the proposed new code have made it an affirmative obligation that if you are aware of fraud, and if you can't take care of it within your internal reporting structure, that you may have an ethical obligation, again, not a recommendation, but an obligation to report that fraud to the proper authorities. So the second provision, the second in the list of, again, this is the hierarchy. The second in the hierarchy is environment. And this somewhat tracks with, right now, sustainability lives, and actually I should have modified this because one of the comments that had recently been received by again, this code it's gone through many, many iterations with many, many different people commenting on it. And so the committee has recently changed this to say natural and built environment. It's not just meant to be about environmentalism. It's about your obligations to, basically, again, both the infrastructure and the environment. And this is, but again, this is sustainability. This is about trying to mitigate within your, within the scope of your control, adverse effects. And if you've heard the expression, the triple bottom line, hopefully that's a common expression for engineers. It's looking at not only just the environmental, but also the societal and the economic impacts of the work that you do and trying to strike that right balance. So maybe not the most enforceable of our provisions, but by placing it in the second tier, it's elevating the importance of this as an obligation for engineers. So again, the third of the hierarchy, so second to society, second to the natural and built environment, is the profession. And this is about, this includes things like fair competition. It includes kind of a change. Actually, looking at item B here, 3B, practice engineering in compliance with legal requirements in the jurisdiction of practice. We have, to this day, never had anything directly about compliance with the law. And the task committee actually looked at that very closely because there was concern about some laws being more just than others. Is civil disobedience considered to be law breaking? Yes, possibly, but it's also maybe considered to be something that we wouldn't necessarily come out at as being unethical. If you're operating in a country where it's illegal to, or it's not entirely lawful to give work to somebody of a different gender, that might conflict with a moral principle. So they were a little leery of going into saying something like practice engineering lawfully. But they did think it was an important statement to say that you should comply with legal restrictions. And in many ways, this is about licensure. This is being about again, making sure you understand your obligations under the law when you're practicing engineering. Mentorship and knowledge sharing, education, some of these are a little more aspirational than enforceable, about creating future engineers and doing your part to enhance the prestige of the profession. Again, possibly controversially, clients and employers are fourth among all in the hierarchy. And these obligations should be fairly typical for you, for those of you who've looked at our current code. Acting as a faithful agent or trustee, disclosing conflicts of interest, keeping confidential information, performing work only if you're competent, and again, sealing work that has been done under your responsible charge. One slightly interesting difference, again, as I said, I don't think the fundamentals of this code are significantly different from what you're used to, but there are some changes, and one small change that I think is kind of interesting is moonlighting. If you're an employee who does work at a full-time, this is an example, your engineering firm works on large multi-unit family homes or commercial properties, and so you don't do engineering services on single-family residents. And you get a job request, and so you think, hey, I'm just going to do this work in my off hours. I don't need to use any of my employer's resources. I'm not going to take any of their time. Do you need to inform your employer of your outside work? In today's code of ethics, yeah, absolutely. Engineers shall not accept professional employment outside of your work or interest without the knowledge of their employer. Interestingly, and maybe some of you think that's absolutely the right thing to do, and I might agree with you on that, but there is I've had a conversation with a lot of people who think, you know what, it's none of my employer's business what I do in my off hours. As long as I'm doing it responsibly, if I'm not, there could be a liability risk if I'm insured, if I have a separate corporation, if I do everything above board to make sure my employer is protected. Do I really need to get my employer's permission to do this kind of work, or am I, again, is it my business? And again, our code, the draft code has now become a little vague on this subject, and so arguably there's permission for you to do that. Focusing strictly on the faithful agent and trustee, as long as you do it in a way that doesn't harm your employer, there's no longer an express prohibition on the code. And the last, as I know I'm running low on time here, the last of obligations is to peers. And again, these are things that should resonate with anybody who's read our current code. Taking credit for work that you've done and providing attribution to other people's work. Somewhat new, fostering safety and health in the workplace. We've always talked about your obligations to the public, but your obligations internally for the people who work on your projects, for the people who live and work in this maybe is particularly in today's coronavirus world, making sure that your workplace is a safe environment for the people who have to go into the office or do work. Again, equity, honesty and fairness, educating the future professionals, not being disrespectful to other professionals or not trying to unfairly harm another professional. And somewhat of a new one, report violations to the Code of Ethics, to ASCE. We've always certainly asked people to report known violations, and even our bylaws says, our current bylaws, many of you don't know this, say that members should report codes of ethic violations to ASCE. We don't really get that, and we don't, my impression is that many people don't think of that. But they've now decided to make that an ethical principle, that you should report violations of another member if you see them. So I'll go through this one quickly. Again, one minor difference that I wanted to highlight. Engineering researcher presents a paper at an ASCE conference that attests the superiority of a particular engineering project. Later it's discovered that the speaker's research was funded by a grant from the manufacturer. Would a speaker's failure to disclose that they had received funds from a manufacturer when they went to present a paper touting the virtues of that product, would that be a violation of the Code of Ethics? Certainly it would be clear in the Code of Ethics today. There is a provision in the Code of Ethics that says, 3D, engineers shall issue no statements that are inspired or paid for unless they indicate on whose behalf the statements are made. Now, to me, one of the big changes, I think, from the old Code of Ethics to the new Code of Ethics is that the new Code of Ethics is dramatically shortened. It may not seem that way because what you're seeing is the whole Code of Ethics, but as you may know, ASCE's Code of Ethics has 4 pages worth of guidelines, 2,200 words. It's now been condensed down to 600 words. So in a lot of cases, you're going to see specificity that no longer exists. And this is an example of that. We no longer have anything expressly about being paid to deliver statements. Instead, all we have is language about honest conviction and honor, integrity, and dignity. Is that going to make a problem for enforcement of the code? I don't know. I think CPC, the committee that reviews these things, is probably still going to be guided by the same principles, but they just may not have as express language or so many specific things to point to when they look at somebody's actions and assess their ethical compliance. So a quick, just a wrap-up slide. Tips for resolving an ethical dilemma. You can look at this at your leisure, but these are the kind of questions you might want to think about asking if you're ever in an ethical dilemma. And lastly, your role in promoting ethics. Obviously make good decisions. Follow your policies, follow the law, look at what universal rights, what's considered to be the right thing to do. Again, get opinions from people you respect. And what feels good about, what will make you feel good, what will make you think you're doing the right thing. But possibly more importantly, for those of you, particularly for those of you who are engineering leaders, help others to do the same. We talk about people who have the strength and integrity to do the right thing in the face of overwhelming odds, or have that courage to stand up even though everyone is against them. But it's obviously easier to do the right thing if you're encouraged to do the right thing. So to the extent that you can create a corporate culture that promotes ethics, that rewards people for complying with the code and penalizes people who don't, as they say, walking the talk, not just having the code that says the thing, but actually enforcing that code and making sure people do the right thing. That's the way that you guarantee, or almost guarantee, or do the best that you can to guarantee that others around you, the people that you work with, will also do the right thing, because it's going to be easier to do. We all want to do the right thing, but if you make it easy for us to do the right thing, we're more likely to do that. That's it for me, and I will open it up to any questions that anyone may have.
Thanks, Tara. This is Jonathan Brower. I really like how you covered the difference between personal and professional ethics, and also that slide on how ethics does change. So I was wondering, no doubt this will all continue to evolve, and I'm sure this code of ethics will, go through other changes in the decades to come. So how do we prevent, or not necessarily prevent, but be aware of our personal ethics and the personal ethics of others maybe creeping into professional ethics? And should we stop that, or should we continue to let it creep, or how do we handle that?
I do think, that's a great question. I do think it's a challenge. In fact, CBC has had a number of cases where, again, professional and personal bleed together. And, I'll just give you as an example. I'm lately seeing a theme of things like people say things on social media. So you put a joke out, and it's a joke that's offensive on the basis of a protected characteristic. Is that a personal activity, or is it a professional activity? Does it become more of a professional activity if you have a lot of your colleagues on your Facebook page? What if you're a supervisor? What if you're a professor and your students are following your Facebook page? There are a lot of ways that professional and personal can bleed together. And some people think there is no distinction. Some people think that, like they say, there's business ethics and there's professional ethics. Well, no, there's not. There's ethics. Some people may think there isn't that line, or there shouldn't be that line. You should, once an engineer, always an engineer, whether you're at home or at work. I'm not quite as absolute as that, because I do think that I don't think it can be as absolute as that, because, so, for example, I think I just did an article about this, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. We obviously wouldn't expect you to be as competent. Competence is key to the code of ethics. We wouldn't expect you to have the same level of competence as, again, a DIY project person as we would as an engineer. So we can't really hold you to the same standard as that. But I do think that there are things that you can do as a person that reflect poorly on the way you are as a professional. You cannot, I don't know that you can draw the line so firmly. If you're the kind of person that regularly cheats on your income taxes, I mean, maybe that's okay. Again, maybe we draw a line a little bit, but does that reflect on your willingness to be completely upright and honest when it comes to, again, your timesheets or something that's more professional in nature? I think it will be interesting to see. Getting back to your comment about ethics being ever changing, I think I have seen a lot of traction for, again, generations are different, and I think I've seen more of emerging than I ever saw before in current generations. I think people do look at somebody and they don't sort of, the word cancel culture is coming to mind, and I hate that phrase, but we're starting to see people that say, even if you're a public figure, if you're a figure that I respect for the work that you do, I think it's important that you reflect your values at all times, and so I'm going to judge you by something that you do, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to your work. And I'm not going to patronize. I'm not going to patronize your business if I think that you personally are doing something that I don't find. So I wouldn't be surprised, and maybe there will be a pendulum. That's another thing I think I commonly see. Maybe we'll go too far in the direction of blending the personal and professional, and then maybe we'll start scaling it back. But I do think it's a tension that is always going to exist when you have an enforceable code of ethics. Is how much does it stretch into your personal life? Hope that answers your question.
Hi, Tara. This is Mark Boyd. I'm past president on the Dallas board. Thank you very much for speaking to us today, speaking with us. My question is about the canon regarding environmental and sustainability. That is a metric and a standard that is evolving. And if we're telling the truth now, if that standard involves looking elsewhere, looking aside, and tolerating when involved on a project that is not considering the triple bottom line, that is not incorporated the state of the art on sustainability, we would all take a trip to the vice principal's office and sit in detention for a whole year. How in the world is something like that going to ever be enforced when you have such a subjective way to look at things as to whether you violated that particular standard?
So I have a lot of thoughts on that one, and I will acknowledge that I think the second, it's not canon, the second stakeholder is possibly the most controversial of ours for the reasons that you articulate. How do you enforce today's code? Right now, today's code says strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure we could ever ethically enforce that provision. We've certainly nobody's ever filed a complaint certainly against it. And I think the current, so a couple of thoughts that I think are worth noting. One, the task committee that's submitting this code is doing so with an express recommendation that this not be the code of ethics for another 45 years. We want to put it out there. I mean, they think it's the best. They think it's the best work that they can do, but they want people to be encouraged to think otherwise. So if we put something out there and we do subsequently determine that we're setting the wrong precedent, or there's a better way to get the message across, or that we're sending the wrong message, it's not meant to be, again, it's not meant to be the Constitution. It's not meant to be that fixed and unchanging thing. So that is one important thing to think of. So again, I don't want that to, I don't want you to think that, you know, this is a language that may tie you for the rest of your professional career. I hope not, actually. I hope people do take it seriously and continue to look at ways to better the code. They did discuss, there was a lot of discussion about aspirational versus enforceable. And there was a pretty significant pitch to make things, we should only put things in the code of ethics if we intend to enforce them. They didn't want to go that far because they thought that there were things that were really important and said a lot about the professional's values, that even if you can never kick somebody out of the society for failing to comply with that, they thought they should be in there. And I do think a lot of the provisions in that section specifically, and actually throughout the provisions, are things that maybe are, again, reflective of values, but not necessarily something that you're going to enforce. As an example, I think one of them is, again, one of them, and I think in stakeholder one, is educate the public about the value and the importance of civil engineering. Are we ever going to kick somebody out of ASCE because they failed to educate the public on the value of civil engineering? No. But it's just meant to reflect values. So I do think that a lot of that language, and for credibility's sake and for expertise, the task committee did work with the Committee on Sustainability to get their language. You know, and you would not be the first person to comment to them that you can't set the bar so high. I mean that no engineer could possibly hope to comply with. They certainly did try to address that, and again, we are still working on that. You know, I can't speak myself as to what I think is the right language, but it definitely was their best attempt to get at language that told you what your values are without making it so that no engineer could ever actually hope to comply with those sustainability provisions. Thanks for a great question.
Tara, with that, I'll wrap it up. Can people find this code of ethics on the ASCE website? Or the proposed code?
It was, the current draft it was taken down because the current draft is going to the board, but I would be happy to share with anybody who asks for it. And then after the board goes through that first vote, it will be put up on the website again. There may be some modifications because I wouldn't be surprised if the board has a word change or some minor changes. But it will certainly be on the website. And in the meantime, my email address is right here. I'm happy to share it with anyone or to make a copy available to you generally so you can distribute to your attendees. We want more people to see the code. We don't want it to be a surprise if it ends up getting passed, which I do hope it does. We don't want it to be a surprise to anyone, so I'm happy to share it to anyone who has an interest.
Tara, thank you for speaking to us today. I know I've learned a lot about the proposed canons of ASCE and how they apply to our practice. Thanks for joining us.